Hello everyone. Today we welcome Daniel Koo from Canada to joining me for a discussion on Taiwan. Do you speak Mandarin?
I do speak. It's not it's okay. I mean, when we get to like scientific language or
Okay.
advanced language, not as much, but I can do okay.
So your family were immigrants from Taiwan to Canada,
Yeah,
and
my parents. Yep.
you grew up in Taiwan or in Canada?
I was born and raised in Canada. I've been to Canada, or sorry, Taiwan here and there growing up, but I was very much raised by two Taiwanese parents, and they're very sort of Asian Taiwanese way. So we weren't actually allowed to speak English to our parents, so that's how we sort of maintained our Mandarin.
Okay, well that's good. Your parents were ethnic Chinese, Taiwanese,
Yep. Yep.
Chinese. Yeah.
Yep. So three of my grandparents were born and raised in Taiwan, but my dad's dad was born and raised in mainland China. And then, uh, for people that know the history, in 1949, Chinese Civil War, the Chinese nationalists and anybody who just wanted to not be ruled by the communists fled to Taiwan. And so my grandpa was one of them.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah.
so for those who don't know Daniel yet, Daniel is uh, cons what he called himself a concerned citizen of Canada whose interest and focus is on Taiwan because of his heritage, and he has a quite a large following on YouTube. He makes I watched the last program on Hassan Piker.
Oh, yeah.
Quite interesting, and seems to me that people like Piker is part of this online tanky group of the left. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what's your political view in terms of Canadian politics or US politics, probably more to the center left.
Yep. For
Yeah.
me, I would identify center left. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so. We're probably in a similar boat, but I think we both share a deep animosity towards the tanky left. So I don't know whether that's the precise description of Hassan Piker, but there are many others who are definitely can be called the tanky left, who I think well, they enjoy the Western freedom in a Western free society. They advocate for a style of politics. They support the authoritarian politics of China and sometimes even Russia, and which is a total contradiction.
Yeah, it can be very frustrating, especially if, most of my family is in Taiwan. And so people like Hassan Piker and others who they're not directly under the same threat. So they maybe don't relate in that sense. And you would think that, there are other people who also don't face that threat, but they're able to sort of see things more clearly and empathize. I
Yeah.
think I think part of the reason, I'm not gonna, pretend to know, the entire reason why they think the way that they do, but everybody, even Canadians, as an example, um, we kind of grew up always being reminded that, we're Canadian, we're not American, and we sometimes we like to sort of lift our chin a little too high and say, oh, we're better in this way, we're better in that way, and so we very much, because we have the freedom to, we as citizens, regular citizens, we would criticize, the U.S. and any number of aspects where we want to, and we kind of live with the comfort of doing so because there's no consequences of doing so, right? So, as free citizens, we we might point to a number of areas where geopolitically the U.S. might have been the quote unquote bad guy, right? And we can all recognize when that could be the case, and there's debates on different conflicts, but what some people sometimes do is they'll say, see, the US was a bad guy here, and then they'll extend that and say in every single conflict the US is always the prime villain. And that's kind of a childish way of looking at things. And you I would just think that a more mature um, way of thinking would just be to look at it on a case by case basis.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, I think to me, one of the main reasons those tanky left supported the Chinese authoritarian government is because their first priority is always to be opposing the US imperialist. And to
Mhm.
them, anybody who is standing against the United States will be their friend. So the enemy of their enemy is their friend. So because their priority is to overthrow the US, therefore any other power, especially China, which is a growing power, which is almost a superpower now. So because China is the only country at the moment which can constrain the US, which has the political, economic, and military capacity to restrain US in many areas in the global theater. So these tanky left put their hope, put their preference for the Chinese system of government, ignoring their human rights problem, ignoring all the oppression of the lack of political freedom inside China, because their priority is not to help the Chinese people gain freedom, but to oppose the US, which is always their first goal. So they are willing to sacrifice their supposedly um, upholding all their ideal of freedom, human rights, in order to achieve their first foremost goal, to overthrow the global order established by the American imperialist. So that's my understanding. I think it's a bit similar, basically, to the MAGA right in America, especially evangelicals, because Donald Trump himself is anything the evangelicals' ideal is against, right? Because his personal behavior, his lack of character, his and his many views towards he's not even a Christian. I think he pretend to be a Christian. I don't even think he ever read the Bible or even went to church voluntarily. But evangelical attached to him because of political convenience, because because Donald Trump owned the libs, owned the left. So because of this, because Donald Trump can exterminate the enemy of the evangelicals. So Donald Trump is their advocate, and they will support him no matter what he does, or no matter what he says, because the transaction. So I guess it's probably a parallel to the tanky left situation. That's my understanding.
Yeah, I see that parallel as well. Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. Like we can talk about like different sort of groups that are involved. With some of them, the tankies, for example, especially the ones that are maybe a little younger. And I think it's interesting. I mean, I don't know what it's like. I've heard that in universities, there will be some classes on Marxism, and it can tend to be somewhat sympathetic to the view or romanticizing the view.
Yeah.
And I can understand, like, if you grew up in the States where, I was born and raised in Canada, and so, we have the privilege of not having to worry about, paying too much for healthcare.
Yeah.
I can understand if you're, growing up in America and you see, all these private interests being put above sort of what we might call common goods, that you might start to sympathize with, oh, well, maybe this sort of farther left ideology might be right. And then what can be frustrating is it can become sort of more of like an ideological game where they're treating it as kind of it's a little bit like a theoretical or ideological geopolitical chess where that's how they're kind of treating it, as opposed to looking at the real people on the ground that have real experiences and concerns about this government or that government. And I'm sure you've heard of the term campism, right? Where they will, like, as you say, like their prime villain in their mind is the US, and then whoever is opposing them they'll be sort of on that team, and it becomes kind of a sport. But I think yourself and I and other people that we sometimes come across online, we there's people who understand like some we have no problem saying, in this instance the US might be, not in the right here, but in that instance it's not the US. It is possible in the world that sometimes there is another bad actor. And so
Yes,
that can
exactly.
be, yeah.
So yeah, I guess yeah, why can't we criticize both US
Yeah.
and China for their
Yeah.
abuses? For
Yeah.
example, the recent the US strikes on the boats in the Caribbean is clearly illegal under international law, and we are free to point it out. And it's not because, oh, what about the US doing that? And that's become an excuse to support the oppression elsewhere. That's probably totally the opposite, the operative principle of the tanky left. What about
Yeah.
the US doing this? What about US doing that? Yeah. And so what's your experience? I mean, Vancouver has a huge Chinese ethnic concentration I think it's probably, is it the biggest or compared to the Indian immigrants?
It's comparable. I don't
Yeah.
actually don't know which one's bigger, but it's comparable.
So,
Yeah.
so what, so they recently in the news there are controversy involving Chinese ethnic Chinese Canadians who has Chinese heritage and background connection to the Chinese government being involved in Canadian politics, and it's it seems to me they have a bit more influence in the Canadian politics than here in Australia, the Chinese Australians do here.
Mm.
So, what's your experience in terms of the Chinese diaspora in Vancouver or in whole of Canada in terms of their attitudes towards Taiwan or their attitudes towards China? It's probably evenly split, as it would be.
Evenly split, you mean?
I mean, well, my understanding of the Ch overseas Chinese group, it's I think it's that has always been tricky. It's like this. The Chinese government, Beijing, seems to think it's a uniform group of patriotic Chinese living abroad who all support the so-called reunification of Taiwan. And to the American conservative, especially the MAGA right, and they all think all the overseas Chinese are so hateful of the Communist Party. They also should all support Donald Trump in his trade war or whatever war against China. So they all tend to think this is like a uniform group of there is this idea of a uniform group of overseas Chinese, but
Mm.
I guess we are like any other ethnic groups, or like say the white people, they all evenly split in terms of their political views. So the
Mhm.
overseas Chinese is a very complex of compositions. There are mainland Chinese, there are Taiwanese, there are Southeast Asian, there are many subgroup of Chinese. And even from the mainland Chinese group, there are probably still also, I think, evenly split in terms of their political views towards Taiwan, which is basically, I think, aligns with their views towards Beijing. So if you are more sympathetic to the Beijing's way of government, you're probably more hostile to Taiwan, and the other way around is the same. So
Do you see
what's your
that
experience?
as a 50-50 split amongst
Probably,
the
I would say would probably, yeah. But so I don't know, maybe in Vancouver, I don't know, in Canada, there are more pro-Beijing factions within the, do you have more interaction with them?
here and there growing up? Because naturally, I remember in elementary school, for example, it just so happens in my class there were, I think there might have been like four Taiwanese kids, and there were also four other mainland Chinese kids. And so yeah, high school, same idea. Although with high school there was a lot more international students,
Yeah.
and so yeah, I'd say I grew up adjacent with them. I mean, we never got too close, but I had some friends here and there. Um, but yeah, we never. It's not like we would necessarily talk too deeply about politics.
Yeah.
So even in my mind, sometimes I am curious, which is why I asked you earlier. Like, I don't know what the ratio is, but my my sense is the ones that may be willing to be critical of the PRC, it's somewhat understandable that they wouldn't want to stick their neck out for fear of being reprisal.
Yeah.
Um, they might think, oh, I'm critical of the PRC, but I'll be more a little bit more private about it.
Yeah, many of
Whereas,
them have business connections and they
yeah,
still have families back in China, so they frequently travel back to China, and naturally they wouldn't want to be too overtly expressing
exactly.
their political views for fear
Yeah,
of retaliation. Yeah, I guess the the the,
yeah.
the reason I think I'm more outspoken is there's a practical reason is I don't have immediate family left in China, and so
Mm,
I don't have any direct business interest and no immediate family interest to go back to China. So I guess that made me a little bit freer to express
yeah,
compared
your
to
views.
many of my friends from mainland China. So yeah,
Right. I think it's safer to be more, private about your views, especially given that the PRC, if they know that you have a family member in mainland China, they could use that against you, right? So I can understand that.
yeah, there were a lot of self-censorship, I guess. Yeah,
Yeah. And also, I think sometimes what happens is, as an example, if I am publicly criticizing the PRC, for example, I think some Chinese diaspora, because maybe they were born there and they grew up there, they can sometimes maybe feel like, oh, if I'm criticizing the PRC, that's somehow I'm somewhat insulting or criticizing them.
yeah.
And that's obviously not the case. But I can understand why that mistake might, come into their mind. And so I think it is also important to like when we criticize the US, for example, we're criticizing the government, right? We're not criticizing the American people, right?
Yeah.
And when we talk about Americans, for example, like it's very much in their culture from the beginning of their founding to be very critical of the authorities. Americans, when you criticize, the whatever administration, Americans don't personally think that, oh, you're sort of attacking me, but they understand that, that's them, and they are not beyond reproach, and they should be criticized. And I think when it comes to, yeah, I think that sort of idea needs to be extended and reminded to everyone, really, that criticizing the PRC is not insulting the people. In fact, like, so me being born and raised in Canada, and my most of my family being in Taiwan, I want the over 1 billion Chinese people to one day have all the freedoms and rights that I have. And it's yeah. And so that, criticizing the PRC is sort of a line with that. But yeah, I think we need to separate. We need to remind people that, criticizing the PRC is not criticizing the Chinese people.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you want the mainland Chinese to experience the same freedom and human rights you have in Canada. I think yeah, that's an interesting point because that's the point I always raised with my Chinese friends here in Australia when we discuss Taiwan, because many of them from mainland China were kind of a pro-Beijing, hold pro-Beijing views. So I always my retort to them always, you move to Australia, you choose to move to a free society of Australia, and you choose to stay away from the jurisdiction of the Chinese government. And then how do you turn around and say the Taiwanese people should then still be be included into the jurisdiction of the Chinese government? How do you resolve that contradiction?
Reconcile that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's clearly a contradiction because if migrants, I guess, and then some of them will say, well, I didn't move to Australia because of politics. I moved to Australia because I'm an economic migrant. And this is true. This summarizes many of the migrants. So they didn't actually choose to move to the West for mainly political reason, but purely just for economic reason and for their children going to better schools, to live in a better, you know, clean water and clean air, things like that. Not not because they want political freedom for themselves or for their children. To them, that's not their priority. And I don't blame them. That's not the priority for most people, probably. And so this is their rationalization of their. So to them, they move away from China, but they still support the so-called the Chinese national rejuvenation, which in the Beijing's term means the 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 reunification with Taiwan, because that's how they rejuvenate the Chinese nation. So I guess this is their rationalization.
Yeah, it can be, and there's a similar, yeah, you talked about the Chinese diaspora in Australia. It's, similar with the Chinese diaspora in Canada, where they are living in a more or less free society, and it can be frustrating, like I'm glad that they're, enjoying the rights and freedoms here, and but at the same time, they don't realize that Taiwan has a similar level of rights and freedoms in Taiwan. In
Yeah.
fact, they're one of, if not the freest and most democratic country in Asia, and we
Yeah, I
want
think
to
they
keep
ranked
those.
Taiwan is ranked number one in the
Yeah,
democratic index. Yeah.
ironically, yeah, and so I think yeah, so it can be frustrating, to see some of these Chinese diaspora in Canada or Australia or the US, enjoying the rights and freedoms, and then at the same time supporting a regime that wants to, annex Taiwan. And I think part of it might be like there may be an emotional aspect of it, or an ideological aspect of it, where you know the PRC is where I come from. That's where I was born. That's where I grew up. And so there
That's how
may
I
be
was educated. Yeah,
it's
because
how I was educated, and there may be some sense of like loyalty, like, oh, but I can't betray where I came from. And so this is kind of how I try to, like, I always try to understand like why people are the way they are. But an explanation is not justification, right? It's just my trying to understand why they think the way that they do. I just hope, like, sometimes I want to, tell them like, hey, you're enjoying these rights and freedoms. Like, the Taiwanese just wants to keep the same rights and freedoms that you have here in Canada. And people like us, we also want to extend, I would also ask them, like, don't you want the over 1 billion Chinese people back home to also have the same rights and freedoms that you now have in Australia or Canada?
um, on your Twitter feed, you mentioned your ideal model of the relationship between Taiwan and China is to sign a kind of a peace treaty on an equal basis and then have peace afterwards as two separate identities. But I guess that's directly against the Beijing's ideal. So how realistic do you think that proposal, your proposal is
Yeah. So, well, I wouldn't necessarily say that. I don't know how much of a proposal. It was sort of like just an idea that, this is possible. Like, because I think a lot of discussions about, Red China and Taiwan, a lot of where the conversation goes is, oh, whether it's annexation is inevitable, or oh, there could be a war. And I just wanted to remind everyone that at the bare minimum, theoretically, it is possible to have to resolve this peacefully. It's just a matter of whether or not people want to. And the people that we're talking about here is the PRC, right? And so there was a time back in the 20th century when both sides of the Taiwan Strait were ruled by authoritarians, right? You had Mao on one side and Chiang on the other side, and they were both authoritarian. Um, but now only one side wants to invade and annex the other. And of course, people will say, oh, well, it's because Taiwan is much weaker now. That's fine. And some people will say, oh, well, so then this was an unfinished civil war, so we should just let them duke it out and nobody else should get involved. And I would argue that that's kind of barbaric. Um, so yeah, I mean, on the people also make, try to make legal arguments, and I was sort of just pointing out that there are two legal pathways to peace. It's just a matter of whether people are willing to go that route, and also a matter of people can debate legal arguments all day long, but at the end of the day, it also comes down to capability, which is why another thing that can be frustrating is when a country that is free, whether it's Canada or Taiwan, starts um, feeling the need to increase or maintain their military. Sometimes whether it's through ignorance or hostile intent, they can try to say, "Oh, well, you're provoking a war, or you're escalating things." When really it's the reverse. Like we just want to defend ourselves, and
It's blaming the victim, basically. Yeah.
yeah, it's the more vulnerable we are, the more confident the aggressor thinks, "Hey, I could do this." And so, yeah, I it's the Twitter sort of thread that you may be looking at. Yeah, that was just my attempt at trying to remind people, like, hey, it doesn't have to end up in a hostile, bloody war. We there people should be aware, like, we could resolve this peacefully, and the bare minimum, like, there within Taiwan, obviously, well, I'm sure you know this, but it's also kind of a divided society, right? And so, and people who somewhat know about Taiwan's sort of political situation will know that, kind of like the US, there's kind of two main parties that have ever been in power. When it comes to legal arguments, it's not like the Taiwan side only has one set of legal arguments that they think, oh, um, why the PRC doesn't have a right to annex Taiwan. There's actually two opposing sort of legal ideologies within Taiwan. And so, yeah, that Twitter thread that you're referring to, I was sort of just pointing to sort of at least the bare minimum sort of two basic ideas, whether it's like a two China policy, where kind of like North and South Korea, where at the bare minimum, it doesn't have to be like sort of the final conclusion, but at bare minimum, both North and South Korea is in the UN, and maybe not all international organizations, but many, like the UN as an example. We could do something similar with Red China, PRC, and sort of Blue China, ROC, where at minimum, like the PRC side always like to say Chinese people should not fight and kill Chinese people, right? Ironically, they're the ones that are doing the threatening now. And when they say Chinese people shouldn't, fight Chinese people, they're saying you guys should just surrender. You guys should not resist and fight back when we try to forcibly annex you. And the
What
other,
about what about the PRC's proposal for one country, two system model? Uh, uh, what if, say, under that model, Taiwan symbolically become part of the PRC, but maintain its separate entity, separate system, separate political, economic, and legal system? How would that work? I mean, would that be a compromise? Because the PRC would never allow your model, your proposed two separate entity model to work. And so the halfway point will be the one country, two system model.
yeah, so number one, we know with the obvious example of Hong Kong that and it's not just the example of Hong Kong. I think there's, a number of other examples that other people like to point to, that if it's convenient to the PRC, they go back on what they've previously agreed to, right? And so I think one China, two systems was originally a model for Taiwan, and they tried it on Hong Kong first, and we've seen that there was an agreement between the UK and the PRC, I believe it was 1997, that there would be 50 years of
Yeah.
one country, two systems, and
It's only
that
lasted 25 years. Yeah.
it only lasted. Yeah, so
Less than that,
exactly.
actually.
So
Mhm.
so we already know that we
Yeah.
can't trust them, even if we agreed to it.
Yeah.
Even if we agreed, which we wouldn't, because
Yeah.
that's a huge. We're talking about the Republic of China, the original Chinese government on Taiwan, giving up their national sovereignty. Whereas with Hong Kong, you could say Hong Kong was never a country, it was a territory
Yeah.
that was also not part of, never been a part of the PRC prior to the UK sort of handing it over to the PRC. And so it would be a much bigger concession because
Yeah.
the ROC was a sovereign independent, or still is a sovereign independent state. And so that by its face, the Taiwanese would we're just not considering it at all. And even like we said before, even if we agree to it, we already know that when it's convenient, when they want to break their word, they'll just
Yeah.
do it.
I
It's
th
more a matter
I
of,
think probably it's more like it's not like when it's convenient for the PRs to break their words. It's because the inherent nature of the one country two system model it just doesn't work because the PRC itself is an authoritarian government model and it won't tolerate any dissent, right? This is by its very nature and its very way of survival of the Communist Party is to exterminate any threat to its legitimacy, any challenge to its power. So this very nature requires no dissent. And so inherently that one country two system model wouldn't work because for it to work, Hong Kong will have to have a genuine different system, political system, where it allows political freedom. And part of that freedom in any free society is to challenge the authority, to challenge the power. But the Chinese constitution actually doesn't allow any challenge to that. So there's always this inherent contradiction. So in the end, so the one country, two system is an inherently contradictory model in itself. So that's why it will never work. Either the PRC relax its political system to allow political dissent, or they have to extinguish all political freedom in Hong Kong for it to maintain its authority. So in principle or in reality, there's no way for this model to work, I guess.
yeah, and both, like you said, in terms of the sort of spirit of the PRC constitution, they have to they will feel a compulsion to remind that they are the prime authority.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's not something that the Taiwanese even consider, because even if they agree to it, we know that they will want to assert as much authority as they can.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
with your extended family in Taiwan, what's your understanding of their political views? Are they more pro the DPP or pro the Kuomintang? Or
There I actually have I think it's actually somewhat even.
yeah.
Yeah, so like roughly speaking, as an example, I think so because my dad's dad was born and raised in mainland China, him and his siblings, maybe with the exception of one who is a professor in Taiwan, might they would naturally lean more blue.
Hmm.
However, my dad's mom's side, who was born and raised in Taiwan, and she had seven siblings that were also born and raised in Taiwan, they kind of lean sort of green
Yeah.
TPP. And so just looking at my dad, it's sort of split. And then looking at my mom's side, it's also split. So
Is there a generational divide? I mean, younger people, to me, this is also why is the reason I think the one country, two system model wouldn't work is my understanding is the younger generation of Taiwanese would just, they grew up in this free society. They have never any emotional or any attachment to the mainland China and they don't really know anything about the mainland China. Why would they be subjugated to their political dominance. I guess there's just simply they're growing away and away from from mainland China. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even say that they're going away from mainland China. They've never been a part of mainland China,
Yeah.
right? So, and on top, although I wouldn't necessarily say that it's perfectly clean, that, the older you are, the more sympathetic you are, because there are obviously a lot of really old people that, support the DPP, of course, right? But that there is somewhat of that sort of tendency. However, at the same time, some young people may be naive where they were born and raised in a free country and they don't understand how to how fragile that can be. They don't understand. They've never experienced real authoritarianism, so they don't know how bad that can be.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, really, and on top of a problem that the Taiwanese society is facing right now is apparently Taiwan is like the number one country in the world in terms of receiving disinformation campaigns, and obviously that's from the PRC. Also, it's not hard to imagine, they have over 1 billion people, so then they can easily deploy, like, I guess,
Yeah.
1 million or a couple million people to just like
And
constantly on
there's
on the
no
computer.
great firewall
Yeah,
on the Taiwanese internet, right?
exactly. So they take
Mm.
advantage of the freedoms in free countries to flood the space with their sort of disinformation campaigns. And TikTok, right, is
Yeah.
pretty popular with the younger people, even in Taiwan. And so they have, I guess, they have some influence over that algorithm. And so you do see a lot of videos showing the best of mainland China. That even if it's not a political video, if
Yeah.
you see, oh, really flashy lights, big skyscrapers, look
Yeah.
at, beautiful scenery, even if it doesn't talk about anything political, you can sort of start to slowly sympathize and empathize and say, oh, well, I've seen so many videos every other day about how, fun and how great, mainland China is. Maybe it's not as bad as what my older brother or what my parents are telling me. So, yeah, I think as you recognize, like the information warfare right now is, I think, pretty fragile.
Have you seen the yesterday Chen Liwen, the new Kuomintang chairperson?
Yeah.
She is seems to me interesting. Her view is that Taiwan should not be the next Ukraine, but I think she had it backwards. She's she's thinking that because in Ukraine it's the Western the NATO allies that provoked Russia into invading Ukraine, and therefore Taiwan should be maybe in her view to be more friendly to China to not provoke the Chinese invasion. But to me, it seems I think she's having it backwards. Because Sweden and Finland joined NATO and Russia didn't dare to invade them. The only reason Russia invaded Ukraine is weak and hasn't joined NATO yet. Therefore, it's available for Russia to take over, and Putin think it will be easy and cakewalk, so he decided to do it. So I don't know what do you think that's her analogy of the Taiwan versus Ukraine?
Yeah, there can be a tendency to think, oh, well, maybe if we did this, Russia wouldn't have invaded, right? There could be a tendency of thinking, oh, well, maybe there was something that we could have done, not realizing that sometimes there's an actor that simply the territory, that simply wants the new territory or territory that they think that their previous version of their government has. So we are